Hello and welcome to the Institute of the Advanced Studies. I'm Ksenia Chmutina, director of the IIS, and we're absolutely delighted to host Erik Bucy today, who is a Fulbright scholar. And when you come to Loughborough as a Fulbright scholar, you automatically become the IIS fellow as well. So we met Erik so many times, and we had so many conversations about all the exciting things he's doing at Loughborough with Loughborough colleagues. So it's so great to host Erik today. As always, just a couple of housekeeping rules. The talk is recorded, and after the talk, there will be some time for Q&A, but we're not recording those. If you have any questions for those of you online, please pop them in the chat. We are monitoring that, and for those in the room, my colleagues at the IIS will be inviting you to ask questions and post comments. And to introduce Erik today, we've got James Stanier. So James, over to you to say a few words about Erik, and then we'll proceed. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ksenia, and hi everyone online. Hopefully you can see me all. It's a real privilege to introduce Erik today. Erik P. Bucy is the Marshall and Charlene Formby Regents Professor of Strategic Communication, the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech University in the US. He teaches and conducts research on misinformation, news literacy, visual and nonverbal nonverbal communication, and public opinions about the media. So Erik's been here for years. We've had many interesting, as Ksenia said, conversations about a whole range of matters. Erik has a long association with scholars in the UK and is conducting research on a vast number of areas. So you can read more about him on the IIS website. So Erik, over to you.
All right, thanks for that. And I just want to say, so where's the
camera mic?
Camera mic right there. Just want to say it's been a fantastic year, and I really appreciate the efforts and the activities of the Institute here. It's been great being a fellow as well as working with people in the Department of Communication and Media. And I get a lot out of the presentations that I attend as well, so I hope that some people can get something out of this one. This is really a discussion about a work in progress. It's a big work. It's about media scandal. The the content of the book keeps expanding because there are additional scandals that keep happening, but it makes it a really rich topic of investigation. So let me launch right into it. There is one key phrase that I want you to focus on. It's accountability. So when we talk about scandal, the silver lining of scandal is that it generates a lot of accountability discourse. It's not just the interest in this is not just from a purely salacious or even kind of attention point of view. It's really about what generates in the wake of a press crisis. Okay, so when we look at this topic, I want to kind of carefully situate it in media and in media practices and institutions, and not in politics. So there's been a lot of books and treatises written about scandal, most of them having to do with politics. There are a few edited books on media scandals, as you see here, a few that are research studies, but they're mostly about ethics, and they're mostly kind of historical or maybe kind of retrospectives on what's happened over the years. In the case of what I'm doing, and you can see my case studies here, I want to focus on contemporary cases, by which I mean over the last 10 or 15 years. And I want to do this comparatively, comparing the US to the UK. And I want to do it empirically as well as kind of thematically and kind of interpretively. And so it's a mix of methods and much broader, but yet narrowly focused on media, not on politics. So I talk about this. This is really journalism practice, and it's scandals within news and media organizations, but focusing on news. So anyway, I'll go over and I'll hit on a few case studies as we progress, but they can be a large variety of things. It could be from a news anchor stretching his resume, as Brian Williams did in the US, to a news anchor paying for lewd photos, as Hugh Edwards did in the UK recently and lost his post at the BBC. It could be traditional kind of lapses, not traditional, but well-known lapses in journalism ethics like plagiarism and fabrication, or it could be things with a harder edge like paying for stories and burying them, a practice called catch and kill. And even things that go beyond this, such as phone hacking, paying for information, privacy intrusion, particularly in tabloids in the UK. So equal opportunity on both sides, and really an expanding ambit of what scandal is in the contemporary moment. Now, having said all that, let me just make a few parallels to political scandal, because one of the best works on scandal generally is by an author named John Thompson. He was a sociologist at Cambridge, and he makes some really good observations. One is that what is a scandal? What are criteria for a scandal? There has to be a transgression of some kind. Well, what does that mean? That a norm, a value, a moral code, a set of ethics, even laws are violated by an individual or by an institution. So with media, lots of times there can be institutional backing for unethical, even unlawful practices. It's really amazing when you start to kind of think it through. Now, it can't just be an event that happens in silence. It really needs to involve attention to it. So the second point is that it has to be known by or strongly believed to occur by non-participants. In other words, somebody else has to know about it, otherwise it's not a scandal. It could be a transgression, it could be a violation of the law. It becomes a scandal when it's really publicized. So that's critical both to politics and to media. But when you have a media scandal covered by media, you get this kind of enhanced effect. We call it meta coverage, and that's what generates the accountabilities. But it really is intensified. You get actions and events at the center of a scandal are judged harshly. In other words, these are generally not seen as good things, and they may involve second order misdeeds, an interesting phrase, which means like a cover up. And so we see a little bit of this going on right now at the Washington Post, which I'll explain later. There's an interesting kind of transatlantic scandal kind of unfolding as we're talking. They're often accompanied by public condemnation once they become known, and they're generally harmful to someone's reputation or credibility. But beyond that, you may find yourself imprisoned or certainly out of a job. So this has all happened as a result of scandal. It's consequential, and it has not only effects on our participants and people involved, but on the public's perceptions of the news and really of the democratic kind of fortitude of news organizations. So it's not a small matter that scandals happen. So again, just to kind of look at the contrast between then and now. In the good old days, quote unquote, a scandal might involve credibility hit to mainstream media, like the miscalled election in the 2000 race. This was only temporarily miscalled, but it was enough to cause a lot of consternation and criticism of news. First, the networks called for Gore, whoops, he's not president. They went for Bush, whoops, we're going to retract that. It's unclear. That went on undecided for weeks, if not months. And so that hurt the credibility of the press there. And of course, plagiarism scandals, which we think, oh, well, that's kind of a lowbrow phenomenon. Maybe happens a lot in tabloids. No, it happens at the New York Times. It happens at the Washington Post. It happens at some of the most prestigious places out there. Also, decisions about to air or not to air stories. And this is happened at the BBC, and a couple of my case studies have to do with BBC decisions going back to, kind of rose over the Jimmy Savile documentary where one of their longtime children's hosts was accused of being a pedophile, but this is posthumously, and they had a documentary and decided to pull it. That became really controversial. So anyway, the problem with some of these events is they attract a lot of attention. They can really damage a news organization's credibility, particularly in the short term. But if it plays out over months, it can happen in the long term as well. And I'd say these days, some of these scandals are not only playing out over months, but if you take phone hacking, over a period what now seems to be decades. So it's really outrageous. And, you know, we almost forget about the 2000 election, but it really left the US system in limbo temporarily. Okay, so what is a press crisis more specifically? And, you know, rather than just describing it as a scandal or using the Thompson criteria, we actually defined it in a 2014 article that kind of serves as the basis of this research, where we realized some key components and processes that needed to be tested. So press crisis is defined as an incident or episode worthy of coverage that involves the news media itself and arises from a major professional or ethical lapse, even a legal transgression, in other words, breaking the law, in the course of reporting in which the behaviors of journalists and products of journalism are the topic of persistent criticism and media attention. Now that's a mouthful, but it gets at the dynamic. And you'll see how this plays out as we move along. And again, embedded in here is the idea that the press holds offenders in its own ranks accountable. And that generates what we call accountability coverage. And the way it's covered is we refer to as accountability framing. And if you're exposed to that and read it and understand it and pay attention to it, that will impact your evaluation of the press differently depending on where you are in the attention scale. Now, here's another way to recognize whether you have a scandal or not. Do you get a blip? Do you get a blip both in terms of the volume of coverage, but also things like searches on particular topics? So when the catch and kill scandal broke and then came back in 2018, you had a lot of people searching on either the National Enquirer or related terms, and you can see these spikes if you go to Google Trends and you input the different terms that people might have been searching on. So one of the ways that we confirm that we have a legitimate, in other words, widespread scandal that's publicly known, is we'll go back and do a Google Trends search. Was this actually surfacing on the radar? And did it have higher peaks at certain times more than others? And that will direct us. We use this to analyze or to pinpoint where we were going to do content analysis of scandal coverage, looking for those accountability frames. All right, that's a technical point, but that's another way to see if you have a scandal. Another way is well, maybe a movie gets made out of some of the tawdry practices at a news organization. This happened with Bombshell about some of the sexual harassment claims at Fox News in the US. Fox News is owned by is a Murdoch News International company, and so it has transatlantic implications. And what's interesting now is that media scandals are kind of changing character and kind of developing a harder edge, you might say, kind of broaching more criminal type practices than ever before. And sometimes these appear to be institutionally approved, at least covertly. And people say after the fact, well, I didn't know anything about it. But of course, the offenders ought to be held to account. Well, how does that happen in an organization over a period of years without anybody knowing about it, particularly when money exchanges hands? So all these things are hard to prove. They take a court of law. So when we talk about them, particularly when you're writing about it, you generally have to use the phrase allegedly or purportedly or accused of, as opposed to this happened in fact. But what's coming out in court increasingly, and Prince Harry has been fighting some of this stuff along with other notable people, and they're starting to win court cases. So there is some definitiveness to this. Phone hacking is real. It's happened. The royal phones were hacked. Either their numbers or their passwords were given out, and it was used in news reports. Like, that's a fact now. So increasingly we're getting kind of harder edge and even more salacious stuff. Good old days, resume stretching, embellishment of your CV. These days, really tawdry behavior by news personnel that you would never expect. The US, there's a case of Matt Lauer. He was summarily fired from NBC. He was the top morning news host, had some of the highest ratings in the US, as Hugh Edwards did in the UK. And all of a sudden he's accused of all kinds of sexual misconduct, not just sexual harassment, but actual sexual misconduct. Those kind of things didn't really hit the papers before. So anyway, this topic is multidimensional in scope. It touches on ethical lapses, potentially unlawful activities in the course of reporting. And also, and this is kind of a new development as well, things like pay gaps or kind of gendered trends within newsrooms. And not just, what's the kind of gender composition of management and editors, but how are women in particular treated in the newsroom? And it's not always great. So systemic equities and patterns of abuse tolerated within newsrooms, that's come up under now the rubric of scandal because it's been the focus of widespread press attention. Again, it's got to be known, it's got to be covered. All right, what do you do with all this? Well, as an academic, you put it into a model and you try to get some explanatory leverage over it. It's a complex process, as anything in society is, but we think it's worth trying. And I say we because my co-author on this project is Paul D'Angelo, who's had an interest in credibility and news performance as long as I have. So some of our work goes back a couple decades. So you have an event here in this kind of path diagram. And stuff might start to bubble up and there might be some hint that something is going on, but then you've got a big breaking story, the second box here, where the crisis becomes a focusing event for the press. So something big breaks. And when you go back to the phone hacking scandal, it was the revelation that a missing girl who was turns out she had died, had been abducted and died. Her phone was being hacked, and this became known at a certain point. And that became a focusing event for the hacking thing, and that generated widespread outrage in the UK. Now, what this does is it results in all kinds of coverage and condemnation, what we call accountability framing, which we call the priming window. So one of the mechanisms at play here is priming. So, as a reader, you're going along consuming your daily news, and all of a sudden a scandal breaks, and all this scandal coverage kind of primes you or kind of familiarizes you with now the scandal at play, and that activates different things that you kind of have but aren't always aware of, which we call press attitudes. It's your judgments and your basic orientations towards the press. And what I mean by that is your attitudes towards press freedom, but also social responsibility of the press. And you think I don't have anything like that. Well, wait a little bit, and I'll see if you can answer these questions. The activation of all this within the audience member then impacts credibility judgments and media evaluation. So not just, are the press trustworthy or believable, or can you count on them, but also things like, should they be regulated more? Are you willing to continue reading or consuming that product? So some behavioral stuff and some regulation stuff. Anyway, we have big goals in this project. Ultimately, it's going to culminate in a book, and we've got what we're looking at is both the coverage, that's kind of the top point, and then the model within the consumer, that's the bottom point. I'll make these slides available later, so I'm not going to dwell on everything here. Keep moving forward, but one of the things we want to do is study media scandal and media evaluation in a more integrated and kind of comprehensive fashion than has been done before. As I mentioned, a lot of books on scandal or articles about it look at it from an ethics point of view. They don't look at the emotional and evaluative effects on the audience. Some studies look at the effects side, but don't consider the ethics. Some studies look at survey and opinion data, whether credibility is going up or down, but don't look at content. And again, it's all kind of piecemeal at this point. What we want to do is really integrate the broader process and hit all the key points, both the coverage, the spikes in searches, the audience attention to the stories, media transgressions and accountability coverage, and then how it all plays out in terms of the audience's assessments and tolerance and kind of appraisal of the news at the back end. So it's a much kind of larger project than just kind of attempts that have been at analysis up until now. So here's what I mean by we have these standing attitudes towards the press. And take a look at these items and mark down where you might kind of rate yourself. And so think of a 1 to 7 scale, where 1 is not at all and 7 is very much. 4 is right in the middle, like you're not quite sure either way. And where would you stand on these? There are times when news organizations, even if they break the law to obtain information, should not be punished. Do you agree with that? 1 is not at all, 7 is very much. News organizations should be allowed to publish and broadcast a story no matter how the information is obtained. All right, where do you stand on that? Invading the privacy of citizens and news sources is acceptable as journalistic practice so long as there is news to report. Now, this is interesting because in the UK, there's a little more tolerance of this legally than there is in the US if you can prove it. And this has kind of been a revelation that's come out in the wake of controversy about the publisher of the Washington Post. He was engaged in some reporting practices when he was a star at the Daily Telegraph for uncovering MPs' expense reports. And that was a real kind of, it made a real splash in the journalistic and political communities. And it turns out later that they actually paid for the information. Elite press in the US refused to pay for information, like to maintain the moral high ground there. But anyway, I'll show you where you group depending on how you answer these questions. Here's 3 more. Now, this is social responsibility, not different from press freedom. Social responsibility consists of questions like, most journalists who work for the mainstream media are dedicated professionals. We should be grateful for the work they do. Mainstream news organizations try to cover the news in a way that serves the public interest. Mainstream media understand the challenges facing ordinary people. Now, some of these items are used in related scales like news skepticism, but they work here for responsibility. Once again, where are you on this? Not at all or very much. What do I do with this? I take these responses, and these come from survey items. So these are large national data collections done both in the US and the UK, and doing several of these, one for each scandal. So the N is usually 1,200 or thereabouts. And you can segment people in a market research fashion that if you're low on the press freedom scale, in other words, you don't approve of this stuff, you don't agree with it, call you a press ethicist. And that's good. And that's kind of a strong moral and kind of judgmental position on how the press should behave. On the other hand, if you embrace the position that the information is important, not how you get it so much, up to a point, we call you a press libertarian. So a little more latitude, don't give me all this regulation and constraints, just let me get the information, or let the journalist get it. Then on the same hand, we can do this for social responsibility. And we call you, if you really don't think the media responsible, we call you media cynic. If you think they're doing their public duty and service, we call you a media custodian. Now, if you take out what we call the mushy middle on the scale, you end up with 4 kind of clear, distinct kind of groupings. And when a scandal breaks, each of these groupings will have a slightly different evaluation of what's just occurred, how they judge it, and whether they endorse things like media regulation or additional constraints or inquiries into the press. So it matters who the audience is. This is another limitation of previous researches. We'll do credibility studies, for instance, and then only look at it demographically. What do men or women say? What do readers versus social media users versus television viewers say? But they're not looking more deeply into attitudes held by the audience. So scandals are focusing events. They activate standing attitudes. They may make viewers and audiences aware of their boundaries, and journalists are also become very involved in this because they cover these scandals, and a lot about press functioning comes out during this. I like scandal, among other reasons, because it's the point at which the press articulates its highest values and what they should be doing on behalf of the public, even though it's a moment of crisis. So crisis brings out what the best practice should be. Now, in the UK, there's been some great cultural artifacts talking about press performance, and one genre are plays, and one play was called Ink, another great play was called Great Britain, and they really address the tabloid practices kind of head on. Of course, it's all fictionalized, but here a fictional Rupert Murdoch is talking to his fictional editor, and they're trying to transform the Sun, and it's just absolutely riveting to watch. So one of the things the plays point out over and over is that tawdry journalism and paying for information has existed for a long time as a business strategy. And if you look at media history, we know about this. And in the 1800s, on both sides of the Atlantic, there was yellow journalism, and there was kind of embedded journalism, people kind of going undercover. There still is today, and a lot of it was to try to get scoops nobody else had for sales. This is arguably raised to an art form under Rupert Murdoch, who, has a media empire now that stretches from Australia to the UK to the US, across all genres of news. But it's not limited to tabloid type formats. And of course, it's not just Murdoch either. It's tabloids, whether on the right or the left. But it's also found in highbrow media, as I pointed out. So scandal is ubiquitous, but the important thing is what happens in the wake of scandal. The idea of a free press, and one that's not too regulated, is arguably another important point. So here, John Lloyd, in the wake of the phone hacking scandal, wrote a book about it, a small book, but a really strident one. And he says, despite what's going on in some of these organizations, the freedom to publish is something we have to respect, and is part of the struggle for democracy itself. And so really important points. And again, if you think of scandal as kind of a generator of accountability coverage, where the highest ideals of journalism articulated, it actually performs a very valuable service. It lets the audience know why the media exists and what it's supposed to be doing. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on this, but if you want to read the slides afterwards, that's good. A point here is on accountability framing, and I'll discuss that a little bit more. One point I want to make is that the effects of a scandal can happen at the individual level, even though they're talked about a lot at the organizational level. So you want to think about what is happening with the audience, because the audience is the individual reader, or they're the social media user, or they're the television viewer who's actually hit by this stuff. And that's what the competition and the whole kind of industry is organized around. So to ignore the audience is to ignore a huge piece of this. So you have to give them a role in your model if you're going to investigate this. And kind of using as a conceptual framework, we look at press priming, which is kind of a term we introduced. There's been political priming, and there's psychological priming, but basically you think of priming as the idea that you think about an organization or an object, an attitude object, could be a politician. And when something happens, say a war breaks out, you think of like Zelensky prior to the Russian invasion. Well, he was kind of a comedian and entertainer who, was kind of a consensus come from nowhere candidate that used his television celebrity to gain office. Kind of happens in the US every once in a while too, if you think of Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. Now the war happens, and suddenly he becomes the wartime president, and people view him from that point of view. So media coverage of the war, Zelensky's position as president, associates him with that coverage. That's a priming effect of coverage, changing the standard of evaluation. Now, apply that to media. People are going along with their daily business, have their standing attitudes towards the press they're not that aware of, but bam, a scandal happens, and suddenly they're associating the organization with the scandal. It's the same kind of priming effect. It affects the lens through which you judge media and maybe a particular organization. This is an overly complicated model, but what we're trying to do, where we have a shift to start at the top, a shift in news topics or what's called issue regimes, results in a crisis, attention to the scandal is generated, accountability framing is the content mechanism, the substance that makes the whole thing go. Audiences, as you move to the right, have emotional responses to crisis, values get activated, and then what? Then judgments are affected, whether it's credibility, accountability, perceptions, reputational impact, support for regulation, and it's moderated by other things that we're aware of, like knowledge, dealing both with the press at large and the stories very specifically. So this is what I mean by an integrated model. It's trying to take account of what's a almost full picture of the process. It's really hard in social science to ever pinpoint an entire process that involves people and society. We're trying to approximate it, and this is our effort. All right, I'm not going to go over this. You can read it more, but we have research expectations. I want to get to when we talk about coverage, how we're starting to look at that. And you take different cases. So Brian Williams, Matt Lauer at NBC, Fox News, harassment, National Enquirer, catch and kill. And we look for particular topics and what we call framing devices or scripts. I don't have them listed here, but I've got them listed later. Anyway, when you identify what you're looking for and what is there, you can then measure it in terms of frequency. And it can either be mentioned high up in the headline or in the lead paragraph. It could be mentioned somewhere in the rest of the article. It could be mentioned way at the bottom or barely mentioned at all. So we call this primary, secondary, and tertiary salience. You can do this across stories as long as you define what your terms are. Then you can kind of look at it in comparison and to see how some of the terms, and you can see here, like with Brian Williams, some of the terms had to do with suspension and apology. What was the original report that he was kind of caught embellishing on, what corrections were issued, etc. You can do this for each story and see whether accountability frames and devices exist. And it turns out they do, but to a greater or lesser extent. Anyway, we do this because if we can't demonstrate the accountability is actually in the coverage about scandal, then our whole model isn't really legit. And so lo and behold, we're finding it, but depending on what the device is or the term is, it may be present to a greater or lesser extent. None of this means the audience is paying attention to it. That's why knowledge is important, because the knowledge kind of determines and indexes whether people are actually paying attention. The presentation goes into what some of these frames can be, and there's a difference in types of frames, accountability versus more neutral conduit frames. Accountability has to do with the ethics and what the press should be doing. Conduit has to do with just the breaking news aspect of what happened. What are the facts? All right, so you start to compile this into aggregates of frequencies, and you can see there's a lot of emphasis on organizational factors, discussions of professional reforms, and individual factors and legal implications. And so you get a nice distribution of topics and scripts within this coverage. Okay, another thing we're doing is we're taking our 4 categories of press attitudes, and we're looking at this in terms of parsing the open-ended responses. In other words, the audience-generated commentary that we get when we field surveys asking people about scandal. And let me tell you, I've got this all in upper and lowercase. A lot of people use uppercase only, and they're basically shouting at you in terms of how outraged they are. And we did this in 2012 in the wake of the Millie Dowler revelations, and people in the UK were just irate. But here's the thing. If you divide it into people who are low on that press freedom scale and they're ethicists, they've got a different way, a slightly different way of talking about it than people high on the scale. So what do I mean by that? Well, first comment on the left, the hacking was disgusting and intrusive. I never want to see or hear about News of the World again. Of course, Rupert Murdoch closed that newspaper. That's how bad the scandal was. They should be prosecuted and jailed for the crimes they committed. Now, press libertarians. Well, it was a good paper to break stories. See, they wanted the information. They didn't care how they got it. And yeah, okay, it was wrong, an invasion of privacy for the stories, how they obtained the stories. However, if it was a serious story that was being covered up and beneficial for the public to know about, then I think they would have been justified. They had this principle. It's like, well, in that case, it wasn't maybe that ethical, but on the other hand, we need the press to have this latitude. This is what libertarians are saying. So it's a really interesting kind of division here that you can see if you separate out these different groups. Now, we did this on a couple different bases. And another thing we asked about were people's thermometer ratings of the news media. Now, we borrow this from political research where the emphasis is always on thermometer ratings and evaluations and emotional orientations towards politicians. Well, we said, well, why not the press? The press stands independent of the political system, at least it should. And why shouldn't we evaluate it and research that way? You argue with political scientists, they say, we don't need to do this. It's everything's consumed by politics. It's not. My assertion as a media scholar is that media matter in their own right. So you can ask people about their favorability ratings, whether they're really cold or whether they're very warm and favorable, about news institutions, the news media in general, particular types of press, and then particular individuals, such as the former publisher of the National Enquirer. Notice I said former publisher, after he engaged in, let's just say, one too many tawdry practices and really tried to go after Jeff Bezos when Bezos was having an affair. Suddenly, 6 months later, Pecker just completely gave up being the publisher of the National Enquirer. There's an interesting story there. Now, if you take our four groups, our attitude groups, and you look at some of the thermometer ratings, you get some interesting differences, although sometimes not as large as you might think. But in some cases, they are very large. So if you look at evaluations, and again, these are thermometers, so favorability of ethicists versus libertarians, those first two bars, the light blue and the dark blue, that's a big difference, 23-point difference in thermometer rating. Ethicists rate it lower because the press isn't behaving to a high standard of behavior and ethicality, whereas libertarians say, nope, I think they're actually doing pretty good. And you see media custodians on the social responsibility scale where they're the dark gray saying, we also think the press is doing pretty good, but media cynics don't. So all of a sudden, press ethicists start to look a little bit like media cynics. Isn't that interesting? And, we've asked about this in a number of different ways. Here we ask about specific tabloid press that seemed to be supportive of Brexit back when that was happening, because Brexit became, the way it was covered became a controversy itself. Some accusations that the BBC seemed to be favoring the conservative position, or at least was giving it equal, not just the conservative position, but a lot of the information that couldn't be proved or demonstrated, equal time as the facts about which seemed to what was going to happen. And so it erupted into a scandal. So we asked people their thermometer ratings about different media in the wake of the Brexit coverage. And here we get different views on that, with lower scores for tabloid and highly partisan press, the highest scores for the BBC, but not very high when it comes to Brexit. As you can compare that with the previous charts. Okay, moving on, we've got a series of predictions, and we move to some mediation tests. Again, trying to be comprehensive, and you can see how much we're biting off here. This is why the book's not quite done yet. There's a lot going on, dealing with scandals going back really to about 2010, happening all the way up till the current moment. And so we are closing the door on our on our scandal window, and are writing this now, but there's a lot of data to analyze. Okay, so what is all this business? Well, this is more of like a psychological processing model where scandal knowledge on the left activates an attention to it, and actually reading or consuming the content will result in certain negative emotions, usually not positive because this is scandal. And you saw some of that come out in the qualitative responses where the people were irate and it was outrage, or they were outraged. And they want things to happen. So emotion is positioned as a mediator. In other words, something that literally can't exist until they're exposed to the coverage. The coverage generates the emotion. On the other hand, the moderators, which are standing attitudes, you walk around with all the time. They get activated when you're exposed to press coverage. But you don't walk around thinking about press freedom all day long unless you walk by a newsstand, you see a headline, you're hit with a scandal. So our prediction is that scandal knowledge will have effects. You see at the right side and the far end, the dependent variables, through both a emotional process of effective response to the scandal that will be moderated. In other words, kind of divided by their standing attitudes, depending on where you are on our two attitude scales. These aren't the only attitudes you can have about the press, but they're the major ones that have been identified in the literature for at least the last century. We've got different control variables. So are you actually paying attention to the news? Do you have interest in the news? Socioeconomic type of variables and even political ideology. So we're not just explaining left-right dynamics. And exposure, we should point out, is really measured by people's attention. And the way we index that is through knowledge. So if you know something, if you can identify correct answers to questions about a particular scandal, then we believe that you're actually paying attention. If you just say, oh, I'm very aware of, what's going on with the Washington Post right now. If you can't answer any questions right about it, then you're just giving me a socially desirable response, i.e. you're embellishing your own knowledge. We want to know if you have actual knowledge, because that proves to be where you really get the traction in the model. And when it came to phone hacking, the whole audience basically said, I'm paying a lot of attention to this. But then when you ask about specific questions, you got a bell-shaped curve where not everybody could answer all the questions. So they weren't paying equal attention. So you run this statistically, you find effects for our different variables and our moderators. So here, social responsibility has a positive relationship with support for regulation. And scandal knowledge has an effect on both credibility, as does responsibility. But when you interact the two, in other words, you take attention and you interact it with responsibility, you get an effect on credibility. And to us, this is where the priming effect happens, is on that third row of knowledge by the attitude. And we found this in 2014. But there's no priming effect if you're not paying attention and if you don't have a variable representing the coverage itself and exposure to the coverage. And the only way we can guarantee that is if you know something about it. There's really no way to know about it unless you talk to a very knowledgeable friend, but even then, your exposure is indirect. And so what we do find is there is a priming effect. In this case, scandal knowledge, when combined with social responsibility, results in a reduction in credibility, but no effect for reputational damage. Now we're doing this across all our scandals and across all our different variables. So I don't have a general answer yet on when this works and when it doesn't, because all the data analysis are not quite done. But we are seeing significant effects. We see big effects using negative emotion as a mediator. And this happens at different levels of our attitude variables. And so negative emotion is affecting everybody, but affecting everybody a little bit differently. Although you can see here in this particular case, not that differently. All right, so to summarize this and maybe get to some Q&A, We're taking a multi-methods approach. There's surveys been ongoing since at least 2012 in the US and UK. These include both close-ended scales, open-ended questions, also knowledge-based questions, hugely important. This results in modeling, outcome assessment, but gives us interpretive insight through those qualitative responses. I want to know what is on real people's minds, not just the way they respond to close-ended scales. And these open-ended answers, what do you think and feel about this issue in the press? They have a lot to say. I've even done interviews with journalists and stakeholders. They can give you good background knowledge about some of the details and when this is known and how things happen. They're not always that aware of how it actually impacts the audience. They're very aware of what's going on in the industry, not necessarily how people are processing it. So you use different types of data for different outcomes and objectives. Another thing I'm doing are focus groups where you take people from the surveys, you know where they stand on the press values scales and quadrants, and you ask these 4 unique segments what they think about scandals to generate even more insight, both on the US and UK side. So that's going to result in at least 8 different groups there. And then, as I showed before, we're doing content analysis just to document the fact that there is accountability, framing, and coverage where the ideals and ethics and principles of the press are being articulated and the offending organizations are being held to account in this coverage. So, like other books that relate to this, including a really good one by Ronan Farrow on Catch and Kill, this will eventually result in a book, and that's what I've been working on. And as News of the World said in its last issue, thank you and goodbye. Although not quite goodbye. We'll take questions.